evening, everybody. My name is Betsy Prohanek. I'm with the New York State Department of Health, and I thank everybody for coming out this evening. We're pretty excited here, all of us. We are here tonight to talk about our public health response plan. We have a lot of different agencies represented here: health and environmental, conservation. We have the federal, state, and local health agencies. We have ATSDR. We have Broome County Health, New York State Department of Health, and New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. One of the things I just wanted to mention, we had a sign-in sheet. I hope everybody had a chance to sign in. That's helpful for us. If we have mailings, updates to get out to people, we like to use that list. And also we had a packet out there. This has got the panel members on it, on the front. And another important part of this packet is we have a comment form here. We would like people, if they could take some time to fill out. It's about a comment form about our public health response plan. And we do have places in the back there to actually drop that. I'd like to take a moment to have the people on the panel here introduce themselves.
Good evening. I'm Bob Dens, Director of Environmental Health for the Broome County Department of Health. With me tonight is Mr. Ron Brink, our Groundwater Management Specialist, and out front was Tony Mastrangelo, our Senior Engineer. We also have Ms. Claudia Edwards, our Public Health Director, here tonight, along with our County Executive Jeff Cram, County Legislator Chris Berger, Chair of the Legislature Dan Schofield, and your Mayor Joan Pauls.
I'm Greg Eularsh. I'm with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. That is a federal agency under the Centers for Disease Control umbrella. With me this evening we have Pat Price Green with our Division of Health Studies. And also under the CDC umbrella is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and we have Dr. Lynn Pinkerton over here.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Krista Anders. I am with the New York State Department of Health in the Bureau of Environmental Exposure Investigation. There are several other members from the Department of Health here, and they'll be introducing themselves as we go around the room.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carolina Shabsis. I'm also with the New York State Department of Health. I'm in the Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Epidemiology, and my main responsibility is to work on the health studies that are being conducted.
Good evening, folks. My name is Artie Block, and like Greg, I also work for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. Unlike Greg, who lives in warm Atlanta, I live here in this area in New York and New Jersey. So, good evening, folks, and welcome.
Good evening. My name is Bob Nizick. I am the project leader and coordinator for the Department of Environmental Conservation on the IBM project, the area-wide study, and a number of other studies that are going on here. And I have with me this evening Carl Berger from our Community Relations Office, and my counterpart at the Health Department is Gary.
Hi, I'm Gary Litwin from the New York State Health Department. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Environmental Exposure Investigation, and I'm also the coordinator of the IBM project for the Health Department. And with us, we have Bridget. Could you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Bridget Callahan from the State Health Department. I'm the program or project manager for the Department of Health. As you'll notice, I'm also on the contact sheet, so if you have any questions, contact me at any time. My name is Gabrielle Casey. I'm also with the State Health Department. I'm a nurse with them, and I do outreach to the medical community.
Is that everybody? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit here about what we're going to do this evening. There's two parts. Basically, we're going to have a panel discussion about the public health response plan, and this will be our panel here. We're going to have moderators, Gary and myself, who are going to ask questions of the panel. What we want to do with this is give everybody information, so that they have an understanding about what we're putting together here with this public health response plan. Some people may be more familiar with what has been going on in this area, and other people this may be the first time that they've really heard about it. So what we want to do is have everybody have a chance to listen to this, and we're not going to take questions until the end. So this is going to run probably for an hour. And then at the end, we're going to open it up, and we're going to allow the audience to ask questions of the panel and the moderators. So we're not going to interrupt at this point with questions, but if you could hold them till the end.
The only thing I'll add to that is if Bridget's going to pass around some index cards and some pens, if anybody would rather write a question down on a card and turn it in when the questions start, if that's easier for you, we'll be passing that stuff out now, giving them out now, so in case a question comes to you while we're asking the questions, you can jot it down. All right, I guess the first most obvious question that we need to ask is, what is a public health response plan and why are we having this meeting? So I would ask Greg.
Yeah, first of all, let me tell you a little bit about public health response plan. In general, a response plan lays out, as the title says, a plan to document historic, current, and planned actions that the health agencies, in conjunction with the environmental agencies, that we're undertaking to address the community concerns and the public health implications related to exposures, environmental exposures in the community. It really describes, and many of you, most of you have the Public Health Action Plan with you. If you look through it, it talks about the actions, timelines, status, and the approaches that we're taking for all of the various actions that we're undertaking at this point. It really helps the health agencies and the regulatory agencies to work with the stakeholders to help prioritize and to evaluate all of these public health impacts of exposures to contamination. It also helps us to facilitate communication between the stakeholders and the health agencies. And really, I think the two main things. One, it lets you, the community, know what to expect from the health agencies working with the DEC. Also, it lets you know that we are committed to a process to try to go through these actions and to try to address the concerns and the exposures to the community.
Greg, now that you told us about the public health process, could you tell us any more about where this public health response plan process has been used before?
Sure. We haven't used a formal public health response plan in the state of New York yet. We have used it in many locations across the country. One of the ones that I'm most familiar with, because I was part of the project, was the Toms River investigation. Many of you may know about the cancer concerns of children in the Toms River community. We used that process down there. And what I did last week was there's an individual named Linda Gillick, who is the person, I think, who spearheaded the community group there, got things going, and kept things going. I spoke to her last week. I said, I'm coming up here to Endicott, wanted to get your impressions of what you thought about the public health response plan, and what can you tell this community of your experience. So if I may just tell you a little bit about what she said. She said, remember, the public health response plan is not written in stone. We call it a living document, and what that basically means is, and you'll see on your copy that it says draft, and it will probably be draft pretty much forever, because what that means is that we are continuing to understand your concerns. We're continuing to find out new information about exposures and our own health findings. And as those things evolve, we'll be changing the public health response plan to evolve with our knowledge. So that was the first thing she said. She said the public health response plan is a joint effort of health agencies and the community to work together to respond to exposures and community concerns. Obviously, that's why we're here. We've been working with Care and Rage. We're trying to work together with them and to hear from you. And also, we're talking a little bit later about a stakeholders group, which will continue the process of working with the community. And lastly, she said, and this is what she thought was the most important, Public health response plan is the cornerstone for guiding all of us in trying to address the problem. And that's really the way we look at it.
We keep saying that this is a living document and changes can be made and things like that. What does the term living document really mean, and why is that so important?
Well, as I was just mentioning, I think it's important because that, go back to the Toms River case. I looked at the 1996 version when we first started that investigation down there, and in the 2001 version, and they're completely different. Now, the actions that were in the 96 version were still there, and we had completed those, but there were different ones at the end that we added, because as we learned things, we changed it. So again, it's a living document. This is not, we're not saying, here it is, this is all we're doing, and as soon as we've done this, we're gone. That's not what we're saying. And that's why we're calling it a living document, because again, as we uncover exposures that we understand better, as we have health findings that come through from our studies, then this public health response plan will evolve. And as new concerns, if we hear different concerns, one of the first pages in the public health response plan is a listing of community concerns. If those concerns aren't congruent with yours, please let us know that you have additional concerns. And the public health response plan can change with additional community concerns as they come up.
Greg, there's
Yes.
an awful lot of people here today, a lot of different agencies. Can you tell us more about how the local, state, and federal agencies will work together on the public health response plan?
Yeah, sure. Again, I'll refer you to the actual plan that you have. You may notice that most of the actions, if not all of them, are multi-agency actions. It's the county working with ATSDR and the Department of Health. It's the DOH and the DEC working together to uncover additional exposures and understand those better. And there's many people working within those agencies on various pieces of this. So there's major pieces going on in one agencies, and there's different pieces going on between agencies. So this is truly an effort between the three major health agencies. And again, we can't do this, of course, without DEC, because they are the ones that are out there uncovering new exposures, emerging issues that we would eventually need to address as a health agency. So that's really what I mean by that. And the other thing, too, to keep in mind is that we are going to be sharing what knowledge we gain, scientific knowledge and understanding of the exposures and of the health outcomes in the community. We'll be sharing these with all of us so we all understand where we are and as we move through the public health response plan process.
If I might add, Greg, there is a history of our agencies working together as partners. This is not our first effort. This is our first effort working with a public health response plan. But on many sites throughout the state in New York, DEC, DOH, local agencies have worked in unison, in cooperation and coordination. When we speak to you, we would like to speak in one voice. And we try our best to do that by coordinating our efforts and working together towards those efforts.
Okay, one of the reasons for this plan and main points is to keep the community involved and engaged. So I'm sorry. One of the purposes of this plan is to involve the community and keep them engaged. What are some of the ways that the agencies can do this? Bob, can you answer that?
As Greg and Artie just described, there's a lot of different agencies tasked with a lot of different items that we need to look at. And it's not a typical role of a local health department is to serve as the local contact, the local link, if you will, to the state agencies and to the federal agencies. And we've worked on many projects in the county with every one of these agencies over the past 2 decades, and we'd like to be able to continue that facilitation with the residents of the town of Union and the village of Endicott. There's some practical things that we can do and have done already. Information in written form has been deposited at certain repositories in the county, the library, for example, and the village, and at the Broome County Health Department if a village resident does find themselves in the city of Binghamton. We're holding monthly meetings with the present community groups, and that's a good way for us to not only keep the community informed, but probably more importantly to hear what we need to know from their perspective and your perspective as to what's important, what the priorities ought to be. So those are just a few examples of how we intend to facilitate communication and keep communication ongoing.
Anybody have anything to add to that?
Well, I'd just like to jump in and mention that, you know, we've already held quite a few public availability sessions and, you know, a public meeting in July, and we intend to keep you informed and keep doing public forums and public meetings and public availability sessions to let you know additional information as it comes out. And, you know, if this is an effective way for us to communicate with you, we'd like to hear that. If there's another way that you think would be better for us to communicate with you, whether it's by email or by our website, let us know. Let us know in your comment forms that are in your packets. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that while tonight's meeting is focused on the public health aspects, the department is still going to be appearing before you from time to time with the health department when we have information to share with you on what's going on the various studies. That's also an important part, but tonight we're focusing on the health aspects.
Can somebody in the panel, can you hear me? Somebody in the panel tell us how people in Endicott have been exposed to contaminants and what is being done to prevent these exposures?
When we're talking about exposure, we're referring to the way in which people come into contact with contamination in the environment. This can be done through direct contact, through inhalation, or through ingestion or consumption of contaminated groundwater, for example. There has been a couple of documented routes of exposure that have been identified thus far in our investigations. One of them is volatile organic compound contamination in the groundwater in the public water supplies. At the Rainy Well, VOCs were detected above drinking water standards, and in order to mitigate exposures associated with the presence of those VOCs, a treatment system was put on the Rainy Well, an air stripper, and Mr. Bob Dens here has a poster that goes into more detail regarding that. As well as at the South Street wells, there has been low-level detections of VOCs below the drinking water standards present. Again, the poster board has the concentrations of those contaminants illustrated on it. And I believe that they are intending to put additional treatment on that well field as well. So those exposures in the future will also be mitigated, even though, again, the VOCs were not detected above drinking water standards. Something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, there's been documented exposures to contaminated subsurface vapors that have infiltrated into the indoor air of houses, and those exposures are being mitigated with subslab depressurization systems. They are analogous to radon mitigation systems, essentially. And as those exposures are identified, they are being mitigated. Additional environmental studies are being conducted now that are continuing to identify exposures in homes that need these mitigation systems. So this is an ongoing process. We also understand that there are some community concerns regarding ambient air quality issues and exposures to VOCs in the ambient air. And this is a twofold issue, one pertaining to current exposures associated with the emissions that are produced due to the subslab depressurization systems, the mitigation systems that are on, what kind of VOCs are present in the ambient air currently, and DEC, Bob, would you like to say something about it, is currently developing an action plan to do further evaluations of current ambient air conditions.
Sure, Krista. The department recognized a while ago that while venting one of these systems doesn't necessarily present a problem, we really had no idea, even after we had vented quite a few of them, that the problem was going to expand to as big as it is. And as a result of that, several months ago, we started to put together a plan and working with IBM to do an ambient air quality study for all of the systems that are being put in. We're just about done putting that document together. IBM will probably get it in the next couple of weeks, and we'll sit down with them and work out the final details to perform the kind of study that Krista speaks about and the health department is going to need to evaluate whether we actually need to put treatment units on those vending systems based on what that data shows and what DOH believes the health impacts are, if there are any. So that's something that we have recognized, we are working on. It will be addressed. But like everything else with this project, this is breaking new ground for everybody here. So you're just going to have to bear with us as we move through this.
So again, that's referring to concerns. That's how we're currently addressing current ambient air issues. There's also concerns about historic ambient air quality, what kind of fugitive emissions occurred in the past due to the various commercial and industrial operations in the community. And that is a much different approach that needs to be taken. We need to identify what kind of information is available regarding historical ambient air conditions. Once we look at the various data that is available and we can determine what kind of study can be done or what kind of assessment can be performed in order to answer some of the community's questions and to address their concerns. And Greg, would you like to discuss how ATSDR would help out with that?
Yes. One of the things that we have at ATSDR is what we call an exposure dose reconstruction project. And part of that entails looking at historic ambient air exposures where we can actually, if we have the correct data, we can actually go back and historically determine what the exposures might have been to the community. It's very important, especially in relation to understanding health impacts and maybe potential studies coming out of it. So if the data are adequate for doing such a modeling, we will be working with our contractors who do those things for us on a routine basis throughout the country to see if we can go ahead and try to reconstruct the historic exposures here to the Endicott community.
Yeah, so again, we are currently addressing both the current ambient air issues as well as historical, and mainly with the historical we are focused on data evaluation and trying to gather what information is available at this point in order to determine the feasibility of doing an assessment. There are additional environmental investigations ongoing in the community. There is a poster to my left that discusses an area-wide study that DEC is conducting. During those investigations, other potential and current exposure pathways may be identified, and as they're identified, we will incorporate them into the public health response plan process. And we will also act accordingly if mitigation, again, is needed in those areas or some other action is warranted.
Bob, can you give us a brief rundown on those activities?
Sure, Gary. The IBM plan for the groundwater was submitted at the end of October. The department is reviewing that now, and we expect to be getting back to IBM with our comments, which will be made public about the end of the first week in February. IBM has also provided us with a work plan for the Ideal Cleaner site. We've completed our review on that, and that response back to them to get that plan finalized will go out, I'm pretty sure, before the end of this week. And then IBM will be moving on that particular one. Shapiro's Dry Cleaners has signed a brownfields voluntary agreement with the state, and the work plan for that has been reviewed. Comments have been provided to Shapiro's, and as soon as those few issues are ironed out, that work will begin. We've also got some work that's going to be going on in a couple of different areas. I believe one by Creative Printing. I think that's starting next week. And as a result of the Ideal Cleaners work plan that was submitted by IBM, our spills people also took a look at that and then went back and looked at their records on what they had done at the Endicott Forge site a number of years ago, actually quite a few years ago, and decided that they needed to take another look at what was going on in the groundwater there. And they're out there, actually they were out there yesterday, today, tomorrow, and if need be Friday, to collect additional samples from, I believe, about 18 groundwater sampling wells that IBM has. And we're looking at whether there's more work that needs to be done there that we weren't aware of before. Then we have the area-wide study, which is entering a phase of gathering additional information through a record system that Broome County has on the use of solvents over a period of record that, Bob, does that go back to the 40s? Bob Dens? All that data that you have that we're looking at for VOCs.
Started
for our area-wide
collecting that
study.
information in the early 80s.
Okay.
So we have a good database.
Okay, so we're going to be looking at information that goes back at least 20 years to try and identify sites where these kinds of solvents and chemicals were used. And if you get a chance after the meeting, if you take a look at the map that's over here, you'll see a bunch of little A's on there. Those are areas of interest that we're then going to have to go back and do some more work on to decide whether those indeed pose risk, and we need to actually take on some more detailed studies or do a full-blown investigation, or whether they drop off and there just isn't a problem. Then if you look a little bit farther over to the right of that map, you'll see a number of, well, there's 4 other locations that IBM has that are known as the Gun Club, the Rifle Range, a few places on the Country Club that IBM has been considering applying for our brownfields program on, and we're waiting for them to make decisions on those sites and submit applications in. So I think that kind of summarizes what we're doing as DEC in the Endicott Town of Union area.
There's been a lot of concerns that have been raised about exposure in the Endicott community. Bob Dens from Broome County Health Department, could you tell us more, based on available information, is the water in Endicott suitable to drink?
Yes, it is. For all the chemical parameters that are routinely tested by the mayor's staff and the water department, routinely check for bacteriological quality, for inorganic chemical quality, for heavy metals that might be in the water, generally naturally occurring. And as we're talking about here tonight, the class of chemicals called volatile organic compounds. Historically, as Krista indicated earlier, there's 2 main water sources presently used by the village. The Ranny Well, which is located near the Enjoy Golf Course down by the Susquehanna River. Beginning in the 1980s, as we began to get the capacity to test at lower levels, we did find levels of VOCs that exceeded the then existing federal and state standards. In 1991, that supply was treated by the installation of a packed tower aeration system. So if you're ever down by Griffin Park there, you'll see a few tall stainless steel silos. That's what's taking those chemicals out of the water supply. The charts I have behind me here show the chemical data that the village of Endicott has been collecting on well field, the South Street well field, which is we call wells 5 and 28, from 2000 on until 2003. The levels have always been there at those trace levels, well within the state and federal drinking water standards, since the village began monitoring in 1980. If there was a trend of increase, I guess we would be more concerned about perhaps that those levels would ultimately exceed the standards, but that's not been the case. So we're pretty confident that the levels are going to stay where they are. Nonetheless, the village of Endicott did vote to authorize their engineer to complete the design for a treatment system, which has been approved by the Broome County Department of Health and the New York State Health Department. And the village has begun the bonding process, and hopefully with additional state approvals can proceed with its construction. So that would be one less exposure from here on out. But without a doubt there has been that low level of exposure, but we don't know where those chemicals came from, at least at this point, but they are within drinking water standards. There have been some questions about the mix of those chemicals, even though they're at low levels, well within standards. Taken together, do they represent some sort of health risk? And fortunately, Greg and his agency, ATSDR, does have a mechanism to do that evaluation.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about that. When you go through the public health response plan, you'll see one of the actions in there is addressing the concern, the question that was posed to ATSDR regarding the mixture of VOCs at low levels in the South Street wells. Basically, the Care Rage folks came to us several months ago and said, okay, we understand that each one by itself is below the New York State drinking water standards, but what does it mean to have several of these at low parts per billion, each one below the standard? And so we do have a mechanism at ATSDR. We have a mixtures work group. Many of you, let me explain a little bit about the issue about mixtures. Basically what it means is that if you have chemical X at 5 parts per billion, let's say for the sake of argument, and chemical Y also at 5 parts per billion. Now, if you would normally expect a health reaction in human beings to be 10 because of 5 plus 5, is it possible, and we've seen this in scientific literature, maybe the reaction is 25, in other words 5 times 5. In other words, those two things together tend to be higher than just adding them together. You actually multiply them together. So even though there's this is a relatively new science, there's not that much information, there is something out there, and ATSDR is attempting to try to address these kinds of issues. So what we're doing right now at our Division of Toxicology in Atlanta, we're going through this mixtures work group and taking the data that Bob has provided us, and we're looking at historic exposures to these low levels and providing an independent public health evaluation of that to answer the question that was posed to us.
Carolina, there seems to be a little bit of confusion and certainly a lot of concern about the planned health study. Could you tell us a little bit about the health study and how the boundaries are going to be finalized and things along those lines?
Certainly. I'm happy to address this. There does seem to be some misunderstanding, so hopefully I can clarify some of the confusion. What this study will do, this study is looking at cancer diagnoses and specific birth outcomes in the study area using existing health records that the State Health Department already has in the State Health Department to see if there is an elevation of these health outcomes. So to see if there is an elevation in cancer above what we would expect to see, or to see if there's an elevation in birth defects beyond what we would expect to see. I mentioned birth outcomes. What does birth outcomes mean? Well, it means that we'll be looking at birth defects. We'll also be looking at some indications related to birth, things like preterm birth or low birth weight or weight for gestational age. What won't this study do? The study isn't going to tell us cause and effect. It's not going to link any environmental contamination with a health outcome. That's really a second step. The first step we want to take is to see, are these levels of health concerns, of cancers, of birth outcomes higher than we would expect to see? And if we find that they're higher than what we think we should be seeing in this community, what we would see across the rest of the state, across the rest of the state for a population of this size and type, we will follow that up with additional actions to address those issues. So where are we right now? Well, we've drafted our health study protocol, and that's got to go through some internal review steps and go through our IRB, which is an institutional review board. What that group does is they review our study protocol, make sure that we're protecting individuals' privacy and their confidentiality. So it's a protection step. And then what we'll do is, we'll release a copy of that protocol out to the community so you know what we're doing. Then we'll get our data, from the different agencies or parts of the health department. And we'll start looking at some of that data. And there's also been some concern about the health study boundaries and how they were chosen. The way that we chose the health study boundaries that are on the map inside your public health response plan packet are based on the environmental data that we've received so far from the Department of Environmental Conservation. That doesn't mean that that's it. That's not going to be the only boundary that we look at. We're waiting for additional environmental data from the DEC, specifically for the area west of Jefferson Avenue. We want to consider that additional environmental data once we receive it. We know there's a lot of concern over on that side. We do know that the chemical contamination is different. It's a different chemical. We're looking at PERC there rather than TCE. So we want to better understand the boundaries of it, and we want to base our boundaries on the science of where exposures are occurring. We want to look at people who are exposed. We don't want to dilute that with people who are not exposed. So we want that additional information. What we're doing is we're moving forward with the paperwork part of this and the data part of this and getting all that information together. And that's not going to affect our timeline. Waiting for these new study boundaries. What we want to do is get two things going at one time so we can have a quicker endpoint. And so we expect, as far as our timeline goes, to have a draft report out to the community answering some of these health study questions by June of 2005. That will come out as a draft document. We'll get your public comment on it, and then we'll finalize it.
Carolina, could you tell us a little bit more about what other health studies have been completed to date so far?
Sure. We've done actually a couple health studies in this area previously. For instance, one of those studies was when we were looking at childhood leukemias in the town of Union. That was among children age 15 and less, and it was years 93 through 94. So that's one example of a study we've done. Other studies of interest, we did 2 cancer occurrence by drinking water source studies. One of them was looking at, you know that Bob has talked about some of the VOC contamination that was in the water supply. And back in 1979, there was a statewide initiative to characterize VOCs in drinking water municipal supplies. And from that, we saw that, there were some data points that were exceeding state standards. So we wanted to look a little further and see how does this affect health, specifically cancers. So we looked actually across Broome County, not just in the village of Endicott, and we did our first study 1976 to 1980, looking at cancers, and specifically for the village of Endicott, we saw some significant excesses. What's a significant excess? That means that we don't think the elevation is likely due to chance alone. And what did we see at that point? Well, we saw excesses, significant excesses in all male cancers combined. We also saw them in male leukemias and female lung cancer. So to follow up on that, we also looked at cancers from 1981 through 1990. I wanted to see, do we still see any of the same patterns that we saw before? And we looked at it, and we didn't find any significant excesses at that point. But what we did still see is, although it wasn't significant, we did see an elevated level of male leukemia. And so we wanted to look into that further. We still see this elevation, what's going on? So we looked at the data much closer and saw that these excesses were primarily among men age 65 and older. And we said, oh, that's interesting. Let's pull their death certificates and see if there's anything common employer. We did that, and we saw a high proportion of them being employed by Endicott Johnson. So what we undertook at that point was a follow-up study among these individuals with leukemia, and we were trying to find out if they were more likely to work at Endicott Johnson than at someplace else. And that may be the study that you've heard about perhaps in the media, and will be coming out shortly with, and this is this Endicott Johnson boot and shoe manufacturing study. One reason that we were particularly concerned when we saw this elevation was that in some of the scientific literature, it seems that there's an association between boot and shoe manufacturing and high levels of high levels of leukemia among workers, specifically among boot and shoe workers due to exposure to benzene. So this is kind of the hypothesis we're going on. This study should be finalized shortly, and we'll release it to the community at that time.
Can I say something?
Yep.
I just wanted to point out that everything that Carolina was just describing is in the Public Health Response Plan. Part of the Public Health Response Plan's goal is to discuss what historic actions have been taken, and there are summaries presented in the appendix of the Public Health Response Plan that discusses all these issues.
There's also a lot of concern about exposure to workers, both past and present. Can somebody speak to that?
Yeah, let me start out, if I will. We have heard the concerns, as Gary just mentioned, from the community during our Care Rage meetings about exposures to former IBM workers. And ATSDR and State Health Department discussed these issues with the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, as I mentioned before. Back in November, Dr. Lynn Pinkerton attended the Care Rage meeting, listened to the concerns, and has done some follow-up since that point to take a better idea as to find out whether the feasibility of doing a study, which is based on several different things. Which, Lynn, if you could talk a little bit about what has transpired since November.
The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health is a federal agency that conducts research of exposures in the workplace and the health effects of those exposures. So we were asked to become involved in the response here because of the concerns that have been raised about worker health. And I've been involved for a couple of months now, since November. Basically what we're doing is trying to determine if a study to address those concerns, to look at the health of former employees of IBM, is possible, if it's feasible. And based on the input that we've received from the community about what the specific concerns are, we're really our emphasis is on whether a study of cancer among former employees is possible. So that really, that's a type of study that typically is done based on existing records. It doesn't really involve typically actually contacting the workers. So whether that a study like that is possible is largely going to be dependent upon the records that are available. So we've been in contact with IBM and met with them last week to learn about the records that they have on former employees and on the exposure conditions at the IBM facility. And we've requested some of those records to kind of get started in this process of figuring out what kind of questions we might be able to answer, what kind of questions we may not be able to answer. And our goal in all of this would again be to determine if it's possible to do such a study, and if it is, to make some recommendations about how such a study should be carried out.
Public Health Response Plan has got a lot of information about outreach for the community. Could you tell us a little bit more about what kind of outreach will be provided for the medical community?
Certainly, I can begin that process in terms of outlining for you guys tonight what are we going to do about the medical community and why. I think as human beings, as you and I go to our physicians, we've developed a cooperative, hopefully good communication with our own private physicians. I think they certainly are an important element of our community, and most of us do have a lot of trust in what they say and how they say it. Not every physician may be as knowledgeable about this specific issue, what is involved, what are the contaminants, and what are the possible health effects of those contaminants. You may be asking them questions, and they may not always have the answers. One way that the agencies, the health agencies, try to assist the community is by working with the local community of physicians, medical societies, and we're looking forward to that.
Okay, we've covered a wide variety of issues here that we want to include in this public health response plan. I guess the big question is, how are we going to do that? What are the next steps?
Basically, I'll try to, you've heard many different activities that are proposed or have been performed thus far. One of the initial steps that we will be taking is to compile all of the comments and all of the feedback that we received from the community during these public forums, from the comment sheets, from the emails, all the various ways in which you can contact us and provide your feedback. And we will update the Public Health Response Plan document accordingly after we consider all the comments. We will continue to work with DEC during their environmental investigations, like I said earlier, to identify exposures and to address those and to introduce those to the community and address whether or not, what concerns, what the community thinks needs to be done in addition to what we are already doing with respect to that. There are many different assessments of data in order to determine what is feasible to do, both with respect to ambient air quality, both historic issues as well as prior worker exposures, as NIOSH, Dr. Pinkerton explained earlier. Those are some next steps that we will also be pursuing. There's also data gathering with the health studies, as Carolina was explaining earlier, and continuing our outreach both with the medical professionals as well as with the community through fact sheets and information packets like what Gabe was explaining earlier. And last but not least, to work with the community to develop what is referred to as a stakeholder planning group, and we'll be discussing that in more detail shortly.
Now that you brought that up, can some members of our panel tell us more about what is a stakeholders planning group, and also what are the expectations of the people who will be part of that stakeholders planning group?
Sure, I'd be really pleased to address that issue. Before I go into the stakeholders planning group for the future, I want to talk a little bit about the past. In terms of our communications, how this public health response plan came together, and who we have been working with up until this point. I think they deserve a lot of credit and mention. There are two groups here that you may know about, hopefully you do, the CARE group and the RAGE group. Since July, we've been meeting with them, this group here, specifically, on a monthly basis. Both of these groups have shown dedication, commitment, work, trying to communicate with the community, give us feedback. If you want a smaller group of what we are talking about here, you have to look at the CARE and RAGE group in terms of how they've worked with us, put us on the table and said, well, what are you going to do for us now? And how are you going to do it? Last night we met with them, and basically we said, CARE and RAGE, we really appreciate what you've done to this point with us. We're going beyond that at this point. And that's what this basis of the public health response plan is, to try to bring in a more balanced, and I'm not saying CARE and RAGE aren't, but we want to reach out more to the community, give the community at large an opportunity to actually work with us. And it's nice to come to a meeting like this, there's no question about that, okay? And hear things. But you've heard a lot of activities that are being outlined in the process that we are trying to develop tonight. What happens on a monthly basis? How can we get that information to the community? How are we progressing with that information, with our studies on a monthly basis? Getting that information back to you. We've been doing that with CARE and RAGE, but as I mentioned, there possibly can be other people in the community who want to be part of this process. This is what we have designated and hope to expand to the stakeholders planning group. I mentioned dedication. I mentioned commitment from Care and Rage leaders and group and the other groups who work with them. It is the same type of dedication, it is the same type of commitment that anyone who wishes to be part of this strategic planning group can certainly either self-nominate themselves, or if they feel they have somebody that they want to nominate, please let them know ahead of time. Please go ahead, and as was mentioned in the comment, you can also self-nominate or enter in somebody that you think can represent you to the best of their ability. The agencies in this case would rather be more, at this juncture, inclusive rather than exclusive. The strategic planning group, eventually, we would hope to be it should be a smaller group, so that when the agencies meet with them on a monthly basis, there can be a concise exchange of information back and forth. Initially, we look at everyone who is being submitted, and hopefully down the line, as we try to form this group, people may drop in or drop out of it, but eventually we'll get down to a smaller group, which is a workable group.
Because they're all dying out.
As we progress, and I acknowledge you, sir, as we progress through this process, it's going to be a very demanding process. As you can ask any of the Care and Rage group, that you need to have this dedication and commitment. This group will go on for possibly 2 years to 4 years, and hopefully meeting on a monthly basis. So it will demand a lot of you or whomever is going to be on this group. But on the other side of the coin is exactly what we would hope to do, is work as an agency with the community in cooperation.
You know, we trusted you that the 80s and the 90s. And
Excuse me, we will have time for questions.
At that time. Your duty is to protect the citizens of New York.
Indeed.
And you didn't do it. I could taste the chemicals in the water in late '79. I could smell them when I was cooking food.
Sir, can we have a second chance at this?
Go ahead.
Can we have a second chance? And I think it's something that I cannot speak for the past. I can only speak for the present and the future in this type of engagement that we're trying to do. And your opinion is a good opinion. And it might be one that needs to be said so in this planning group.
You know, I'm just tired of everybody kissing everybody's butt for IBM's safety. IBM has been killing people for 50 years.
You know, interestingly enough, sir, and this is something that the group will have to figure out, okay? Who's going to be on this group? There certainly has been indications, and there's been people have said, well, why isn't IBM, or why could IBM be on this strategic planning group? It could be a possibility. I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it isn't at this point. That's something we will develop as we go along. Nothing's carved in stone at this point. It's an evolving process.
It should have been carved in stone in '79 when you caught them dumping 4,100 gallons of vinyl chloride in their own private dump. And this is not a spill, it's a dump.
All right. So
can we please get through this part of the process first, then we'll open up.
I'm going to deal with the facts.
That's fine. You'll have your opportunity, but could we please just let them continue?
And you're trying to sugarcoat a very explosive problem. Ladies and gentlemen, volatile means boom, gone. It means explosives. It doesn't mean a little firecracker going off. We're talking about gone, 20 miles in every direction. Those 200 holes connect, we're done. Goes above 95 degrees, we're done. You start dropping the odds off of your explosive rate. As soon as it goes above 95, just like that. I almost watched the west side of the city of Ventura blew up because of that, because of the hydrocarbons. You have no idea how dangerous this stuff is. You made most of those chemicals out of it. You also got carbon tetrachloride in the plume. You know, I reported the 11 chemicals to Chesapeake Bay Commission, and they told me that they think I was right, that that's exactly what's killing all the livestock in Chesapeake Bay.
All right, sir. Sir, if you give me a moment now, we're almost finished with this presentation.
Yeah, I'm finished. You know, you guys are just playing games. This belongs in federal court. This has been a crime since day one. A federal crime.
This is a discussion on how we're going to proceed with this public health response plan, and would like to try to keep the comments relevant to that.
In January of 1980 when I told you about it. I came to the New York State office. I also went to Ford County's health office, and they blew me off like I was nobody. And firemen witnessed it, everybody witnessed it.
All right.
All right, let us continue.
Christmas,
Please let us continue, sir.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, let me use a key phrase here for the stakeholders group. It's balanced representation. And hopefully that's what we're going to try to achieve working with you, the community, to achieve this end of a stakeholders group. What can you expect from a stakeholders group? Well, certainly I think we mentioned, and I mentioned certainly, meeting once a month. And I think that's so very important to provide you with the updates, to let you know the status of what's going on and how we're proceeding with that. So yeah, meeting once a month. We would hope and look forward for the stakeholders group to provide advice and guidance to us, the agencies, as we develop our public health response plan, as we go along with it and through it. There is a comment sheet. Bridget, I think, has those available, and please fill those out if you feel that you want to be part of this group. And I think with that, I'll conclude. Anybody else want to add anything to this?
Krista?
Yes, I do. I just want to mention that the stakeholder planning group is one component of continuing outreach that will be done, that there will be opportunities for the overall community, if you're not a member of the stakeholder planning group, to communicate with us. We hope to still continue with public availability sessions, public meetings, perhaps after, on the same day that the stakeholder planning group meets, after they have their meeting, we can open it up to the general public later in that evening. It's just outreach such as that, where the community, if you're not part of the stakeholder planning group, while we would expect members of the stakeholder planning group to communicate with the community, to share with them what activities have been occurring, we too would still be coming back and discussing issues with the community like we're doing now.
We have comment boxes in the back for the, or the boxes for the comment forms to complete as you go out the door and actually out in the corridor.
The other thing, we can't stress enough how important the comments are. You know, as we've said, this is a living document, which means it can change with the wishes of the community. This is the first time we're doing this in New York. We've done similar things, but in this particular public health response plan, this is the first time. And we're very open and very objective as to what people might think, what people might want. But the only way we're going to know that is if you give us the comments. And as far as the comment sheet themselves, they're here. If you have comments now, fill them out and give them to us. But don't let it end there. I mean, take an extra sheet home. If you think of something tomorrow, there's contacts for people in all the agencies. If you have questions, please call them up. All the people on that sheet have talked to numerous people at length and are happy to do it. You can email us information and questions. We really need your involvement to make this work. And, you know, if there are folks here, take some extra ones home. If you know folks that might have comment and aren't here, give it to them, explain to them what goes on. These fellows that are videotaping here, this is going to be on the air in a couple of 2-3 weeks perhaps. When we find out the date, we'll try to get that information to you so you could tell people who may not be here who might be interested in seeing what went on here. That'd be a good forum for that. So, I mean, I don't know what else, you know, we're pretty much wide open to anything. Krista?
For the people that would be watching this later, maybe you could read off our email address so that they can write it down and send us comments in case they don't have the documents.
Bridget, you want to do that?
Try to speak loud enough for everybody. It's kind of long, so.
Speak into
Here,
the
Bridget.
microphone, Bridget, so the...
Okay, it's fairly long, so it's BEEI at health.state.ny.us. And I'll be taking all those comments and compiling them just as I will with faxes and phone calls, as well as the ones that you could drop off or mail in.
You want to
Why don't
give
you
the...
repeat it?
Would you like to hear that again? Sorry.
Yes.
BEEI at health.state.ny.us.
Okay. With that, we'll open it up to questions, and we'll collect the cards that anybody might have filled out and maybe walk around with cards again in case anybody wants more or didn't take one that might want one now. And if you could please come up to the mic with your questions.
Hello, my name is Dan Flannery. I'm from Johnson City. I lived in Endicott, unfortunately, in '79 when this occurred. I wanted to ask the DEC man here, have you considered what that 130,000 gallons of water we're doing is to the subterranean underground to Washington Avenue? Have you thought about that?
That is something that is being looked at.
That's going to undermine the surface and foundations of most of the buildings on that street, including the school.
Get it. We had asked IBM to do a supplemental groundwater assessment, and they've done quite an extensive study of what the groundwater flow patterns are in the area. That report is in the public library, and we're in the process of evaluating that. So, but beyond that, I really can't address your question at this point, but other than to say it's being looked at.
Hi, I'm Wayne Richardson. I've been at every meeting since this whole issue came to light last February, approximately. I think it was January or February when they had the original meeting. At that meeting, I wrote a letter, 2.5 pages, why I felt my home should be tested, and after reviewing the information there and stuff. And I'm going to tell you folks, we've come a heck of a long way since that meeting when nobody really knew nothing about what was going on there. And to be quite honest, I don't know how you people don't realize some of us who have residences, businesses, rental properties, this is taken on the parameters of a Stephen King movie down here. I mean, this is unbelievable. The concerns I have for my children, you know, medical problems that we wrote off as okay, you know, this, that, one thing, are on your questionnaires you gave us 6 months ago, and this is a concern a lot of us had, was I don't see a lot of people at this meeting because we've become so jaded that the health department and the DC were blowing us off. I got my house tested. I have the second highest numbers of anybody I've seen in Endicott, the highest numbers of anybody in a residential home. When I took those numbers, when there was no explanation at that first meeting, the second meeting when we went down to the church again, and I spoke with Gary's agent there, who was the head of the project at the time, and we had an hour discussion. And where he would sit there and tell me, you know, first of all, I asked him, I said, how did you base this number that was tested in my basement? And he's like, oh, you got no problem. He says, if your number was 48,000, he says you'd have a genuine health concern. The number tested in my basement was 21. Well, I looked at his chart there and I says to him, I says, first of all, I says the number 1 inch under my slab was 3,800. And I says, you're telling me I got more cracks than the Dead Sea in this basement floor, that only 21 parts of this stuff are coming up into the basement. And he sat there and says, well, yeah, that's about right, and this and that. And he says, I says to him, I says, how do you base your standard? And he says, well, this is based on OSHA standards. I'm like, that's for a 200-pound man working 8 hours a day in this stuff. So anyway, we continued on. At the end of this hour discussion with him, I says to him, I looked at him, I says, how much money does IBM have in your offshore account to sit here and coddle the residents of Endicott? I looked at these people as they were our watchdogs. The first thing I said to them at the second meeting, you're supposed to be our watchdogs. To be quite honest, the answers I received from the health department and the DEC were not good. Now, I realize this is a blue ribbon panel here now. This is the panel that I would have liked to seen here 6 or 7 months ago, not now when, you know, everything else has come to light. You mentioned the Toms River case. I've watched the movie on civil action, and I realized the case there was the water had it in it. The stuff was in the water itself. This is not the case here. But does anybody truly know what the effect of this stuff rising up in our houses is? Because at that meeting where I spoke with your man, Dan, there, he told me, he says, oh, it's not coming up out of the basement. I'm like, what do you mean? It's becoming a gas. Its whole job is to go up. I go, the heat kicks on. You're telling me it doesn't rise up in our house? No problem. He says, you got nothing to worry about. I didn't quite buy that. Another question I have is, if I spilled 5 gallons of something up the street from IBM or whoever the perpetrator is, they claim they're not the only one. If there's somebody else, like I told them at the one meeting, you show me who it is. They refuse to answer that question. They wouldn't give me 20 years or 30 years to clean it up, that's for sure. There'd be 3 guys with yellow hard hats on the next day watching me dig it out and replace everything and haul it to Rochester. Why are they being given such a free hand to basically do whatever they want? I mean, they sit down the end of my alley, they're cutting wells, they're putting these black things in that look like they're out of the movie Alien. Next thing, those things are gone, they're all loaded on trucks and out of here. Basically, they just dump them, put fences up, do whatever they want. Well, why aren't we even informed or asked, is this okay? You know, one morning we get up and look out and what the heck are those things?
Wayne, you're asking a lot of questions. Why don't we start answering them one by one, because otherwise it's going to get a little confusing. So why don't we start with the one about the OSHA, using OSHA as a basis for numbers?
Yes, when I'm with one of the law firms and they mentioned numbers that were 1,000 times less than what the OSHA standards were, was what the EPA standards. When I asked Gary about it the last time we talked, he told me there is no standard, that standard had been dropped.
We had a conversation in the visitor center when we were there, and I said that we were not basing our numbers on OSHA numbers.
Correct. And when I asked you about the EPA number, you said, well, that number had been dropped. That was no longer an effective number.
It's like the EPA number for TCE. They're re-looking at it right now. It's not that they've just dropped it.
Okay.
But
so hopefully
you and I had we had a discussion about the levels in your home and how that was arrived at and everything else, and I thought that you were comfortable with the answers that I had given you at the time. So are you just bringing up,
I would like to hear a number. Is there a number that is acceptable for breathing? Because I mean, I got some real serious numbers in that basement.
The number that we've come out with, a guidance number for TCE, is 5 micrograms per cubic meter. As an ambient air number. There are no standards for indoor air for these things in the state. 5 micrograms per cubic meter is what we've been using as a guideline where we need to do something, but that doesn't mean that we don't have concern at levels below that. As we discussed, you know, what IBM was doing, if they detected anything, they were putting a mitigation system on. And the key to the whole thing is, you know, we deal with both the potential of underneath your basement, but we're most concerned that things not get into the air in your home. So,
well, just to interrupt you, when the testing was done, you know, I had to laugh when 3 IBM guys show up with badges on to do the testing. And I'm like, well, where's the DEC guy to oversee this? And they're like, well, no, we're an independent subcontractor for IBM. And my analogy at the previous meetings was, well, if the chickens are missing, you don't send the fox or the coyote to go see what happened.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a valid point, but unfortunately we don't have the resources to have somebody accompany everybody in the state that's doing work on hazardous waste sites.
Well, I would like to think this is a pretty serious issue. This is
absolutely, and it's not like there aren't checks made and people don't check up on what they're doing, but being everywhere with them every minute is just not a possibility.
That's how you kept the EPA off your back. You filed everything in through the back door, so nothing went in through the EPA. The EPA didn't know about it. They couldn't do anything about it. That's all what I discovered. Not one of these agencies filed a report. I found that out at the end of May, and I set IBM up, and they fell for it. They fell for it.
Can we, if you have questions and comments, that's fine. But could you get in line and wait your turn like everybody else, please?
I am disabled. My apologies. But the point is that this game's been going on for over 24 years. It's not going on anymore.
Well,
Gary, bottom line in this whole thing is, we're very concerned here as residents. As I said at the meeting the other night when they had the occupational people from IBM previously, I worked there at the critical times, right there in 055, this, that. How do we know if we have something? My kids, I mean, they were born and raised, conceived in this home, this, that. I mean, there is no testing for us to go to find out. Do we have to wait till we got warts growing off our back or something before we know? I mean, we were seriously exposed to this stuff.
Historical exposures are always a problem. I mean, the issue that you bring up is a relevant issue to this process, this public health response plan. People have similar concerns. What were we exposed to in the past? What might that mean? That's part of what this plan would seek to find answers to those questions. How that might happen, we can't tell you right now, because what we want to know is, relative to what you just voiced, do people have similar concerns? Is there, one way to look at it? Any of these studies, you have to start with what's the question you want to answer. And, we have to define and refine those questions. And that should be something that you're bringing up valid questions, but, it would be better for everybody involved, the community as a whole, if the whole community said, yep, what Wayne asked you, that's what we want to know, and that's exactly the question that we need answered, then we can proceed with it. But if somebody else says, well, that's not quite what I want to know, and then we need to talk about it and come to some consensus on what is the question that we need answered.
Okay, and that brings up another point that I have. You can see by the few residents here tonight that there's a heck of a lot more people affected by this. And I know personally around my home that there are quite a few elderly people that I know are not attending these meetings at all. So how are you guys going to reach out to each one of these homes and speak with these individuals to find out what health concerns or problems they have?
The way we did reach out, because of what you say, to the elderly community, we had a session exactly like this afternoon.
Right.
That would be easier for them to get to, and we had about 40 people show up at that.
Well, some of them just don't care anymore. And they never cared to begin with. They never were there. They're just too old. They don't go out of their homes. I see them. You never know they live there if I didn't see them take out the garbage once in a while. Yep. And the final thing I'm going to say and give everybody else a chance here, and this is just for the gentleman on the end, and you've already seen what I brought previously, to tell me that we got no problem with the water in Endicott. I brought this sample 7 years ago to the Village Endicott meeting. This came out of my tap. And I asked at that time, what was this? And Mr. Cudgis, the engineer at the time, who I already had words with over trying to drill a well in my backyard for a bait operation, and he sat there and we had an hour conversation on this deal, and he told me there's no way he's going to let me cut a well out there because there's a problem with the contamination in the groundwater and this and that. And I says, well, I don't care. I says the minnows are going to swim in it and I'm not going to drink it or nothing. And we finally came to the point where I says to him, I says, what do I have under my house, the Love Canal? And he looked at me in no uncertain terms in his suit and tie, said, look, there's no effing way you're cutting a well behind your house. And that's the end of our conversation. So I brought this to the village board, and they told me, well, that's normal from flushing hydrants and this and that. And I have a relative who works for the water department. There was no hydrants flushed in that time. This was 7 years ago. I was told if I wanted to test it, to take it myself and pay somebody. Well, on September 18th, I took this sample out of my tap. I've got numerous samples over time. I will leave the sample with you tonight so you can take it and tell me exactly what that is that's coming out of my tap water. I have samples in my neighbors have taken, same problem. I mean, this thing's got a life of its own in there. So I'm going to leave this with you.
We have your address, Wayne?
I don't know if you do for sure. 109 McKinley Avenue.
Okay.
All right, well, Wayne's given Bob his address. Can we have the next question, please? You've been very patient waiting there, thank you.
My name's Ruth Blizzard, and my question is for the representative of NIOSH, and I'm sorry I forgot your name. I'm happy to hear that you are initiating an investigation to look at the effects of chemical exposure to employees of IBM on the job. You said that your method would be to ask IBM for their records. Do you have a contingency plan in case IBM says that they can't find their records or they're otherwise uncooperative?
Basically, to do a study like this, we have to have a list of all of the employees at the facility as a starting point. And usually that is obtained through a company, the employer. And there are cases where we can assemble a record of who worked at a workplace, if there's a union, for example, and from the union records. But with IBM, it's really the only way I know of to come up with comprehensive lists. But IBM has said they have those records and they plan to provide those records. So I really don't anticipate a problem with obtaining the records from IBM. We are focusing on whether it's feasible to do a study looking at cancer. In order to do that study, what we would do is obtain information from IBM at who worked at IBM, where they worked, information about the processes that occurred there, the chemicals that were used, exposure levels, perhaps, that they measured. We'd have to look at all of those things and see how well we could characterize the actual exposures that occurred to the employees. That's the type of information that we would rely on IBM for. We would not rely on IBM to tell us if someone had cancer, because they may not have comprehensive records, they may not have accurate records. We would do things like look at how many of the former employees have died and what have they died of. Did they die of cancer? Did they die of a particular type of cancer more commonly than, more than you would expect? We might, for instance, look at the cancer registry, the way the health department is planning on doing, and identify cancers that had occurred among former employees that way, and compare what we observe to what we would expect. So we wouldn't rely on IBM for the health data.
I had to get up here and give you one hard question. No, actually, I have a question, and it's not very difficult. But I also have a comment. 6 months ago and before, when I got involved in this as organizing the care organization, we were just I was an upset mother whose daughter had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I met with other people, and we started to develop some things. When we first met with this group of people, you had to really keep an open mind. And I wanted to add to Artie's list of things that you need, the expectations of a stakeholder planning group, because that's what we've been doing for several months. And dedication is definitely one of them, and commitment, and it needs to be inclusive, because it has been a small group of us, and it is time consuming. But the other thing you have to remember is you have to keep an open mind. You cannot shut doors. You've got to leave them open. I have seen the work that has been done. I couldn't believe that a community, some of the just community members have been able to go before the department, the DEC, the DOH, NIOSH, politicians, and be able to move some of the mountains we've moved. And we have a lot more work to do, but if anybody here truly has any concerns and really wants to get involved, I highly recommend that you do it through a stakeholder planning group, and that way you can also become educated, because I was not educated in any of this prior to joining. And the education is what has caused me to have a little bit more faith in the people that we see every month, and we educate them as well to our community. It needs to be a relationship. And there's rocky moments. I mean, and it's true, we have given them some really tough questions, because we are an intelligent community and we have legitimate concerns. So I just want to say that this group up here, I can now stand here and be comfortable to say that they are a wonderful working group, and they are working with us. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have stood here and said it. And they know it. And I told them, they're not our friend here. We don't trust you. And I came right out and told them, and they knew it. And they asked, what can we do? And I told them. And so keep an open mind. And the other piece is, don't come into a group with an agenda. The only agenda you should have, if you are going to be on one of these committees, is the community of Endicott, the village, and the town of Union. If you have any other agenda, you don't get on the committee. And that would be my personal rule, because you won't get the job done effectively. So that's my spiel. The question I have is, I was just looking over the information sheet and you were discussing exposure. And this is a really nice information sheet because it gives exposure in layperson's terms. Being in the nursing profession, I understand the dosing and how important dosing is, and higher doses in children. I read that and I thought about the South Street well and the low levels that are below standard. The first question is, how are those standards calculated? And are they done, is their body weight figured into that calculation? And the second question is, if a child is exposed to the same amount of chemical as an adult, and the child can be affected more than the adult, then maybe there's no risk for the adult. However, with those low levels, are these children at risk because of lower level, based on your explanation in here?
I'll handle that one. Basically what you're saying is the maximum contaminant limits that we come up with for standards for drinking water doesn't include a kid. Basically, you know, the premise is that that's drinking water that's going to come to a household, a residential area, and we know that children are going to be there. So certainly they're considered in the calculations. There's also an awful lot of conservancy built into those particular standards. Different standards are arrived at different ways. Some are really entirely risk-based. Others have risk management elements that might cause them to be a little less protective than others might be. All of them are protective, but there's degrees of protectiveness. But the drinking water standards particularly, and I'll ask Greg to follow up on this after, because a lot of them are, I mean, basically the federal government comes out with drinking water standards under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and then the state, you know, may go beyond that and lower them, but certainly they have none that are any higher. But one of the premises they start out with is that you drink 2 liters of water a day, which most people don't, and that you drink the water from that same source for 70 years. Now certainly a child isn't going to do that, so there's different assumptions for a child. But they look at, you know, like, I don't even want to say the average. They look at, like, what's worst case for somebody in a home to do it, you know, the mixed formula with water and this and that and the other thing. I'm not a toxicologist. I couldn't tell you, although we can get you that information of what all these exact calculations is. But beyond that, a lot of this is based on unknowns. And wherever there are unknowns, then you put in factors of safety. So say you came up with a number of, just for argument's sake, 100 is safe. But there's a few things we don't know. So we'll divide it by 100. To make up for what we don't know, and then 100 may become 1. So in the drinking water standards, they do include kids, and they're very conservative standards. And Greg, you want to follow up on that?
Just one other thing. I mean, ATSDR does not set drinking water standards. However, the process is certainly understood by us. One of the things that I just extrapolate on what Gary had said and make it clear is that you know, certainly in this field of environmental health in relation to exposures to contaminants, it's not, we don't have perfect knowledge, obviously. We do have some knowledge about a lot of things like high dose exposures to animals or to humans, and we don't have a lot of information about what it means for low levels. So, and as Gary was saying, for some of these chemicals where we don't have as much perfect knowledge about, we actually build in more safety factors. The more we know about something, the better we're able to determine a level that we don't think adverse health effects would occur. So the less we know about it, then the more safety we need to build in. So the process that New York State does is similar to the process that the US EPA does, or what ATSDR does, in just generally calculating exposure doses and trying to understand what the public health implications are. So I think that's all I have to add.
And I think we answered the second part of your question in that, or not? I mean, you were saying if that wouldn't come into play then.
Well, it was just as far as the dosing, the amount, but that, the toxicology calculations, there is a formula?
I don't. Yeah, there's a process. I mean, it's not like a thing. It's a whole big process.
There's two things. Yes, there are formulas for cancer. EPA and also the state uses a model, because I remember I mentioned before that they have a lot of information about high dose animal studies or whatever. We don't have what it means here. So what they do is actually they consider a model, a very conservative model, and say, okay, what would a certain risk, like 10 to the minus 6, which means like 1 cancer and 1 million exposed individuals, what would that level equate to? Okay, and they draw that line down. This is for cancer. Now for non-cancer, then that's when they do the margins of safety from the studies that have actually shown effects. So you may have a study up here of humans or animals where they actually showed a health effect. But the level down here that we consider protective, this margin of safety is built in based on all those factors that Gary mentioned, and the knowledge that we have. If we have good data here, it might be closer. If we have very bad data, then it may be lower because you want to build in more uncertainty factors. Does that answer your question? Sort of?
If you want further detail on it, Bernadette, we can get it for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Mark Bacon. I own a building on 1412 North Street. I heard Wayne say that he was pretty high levels there. I probably got beat by about 4 times. I probably got beat by about 4 times, but I talked to Gary here at the last meeting about getting my building retested from IBM. I'm sitting in there. I've been sitting there for a year and a half. Since the ventilation system got in there in June, I'm hearing this stuff about the ventilation systems. Now they're going to test the air coming out of them. People told me when they got put in there to have them install ventilation systems, said that the insurance companies might not cover us, because who knows what's going on with this stuff. But my whole thing is I just want somebody to come in there and retest my building to show me that they got rid of the problem. Can you help me with that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Bridget. Bridget will speak to that.
Well, I have spoken to you several times, and I know you've spoken with Gary, and we have been speaking with DEC and letting them know the next time that we meet with IBM, we are going to say, we want your house tested. That has been documented, and I thought I told you that in the last conversation.
It's just, I know that they're testing, like they tested my brothers the other day, and they haven't heard nothing from them. And like in the beginning, with the ventilation systems, I got the worst numbers. I've heard there's one more higher than me, but so.
But we have made your wish known.
Yes, thank you.
We're going to read some of the questions that people.
If South Street well VOCs are below state, federal standards, why is extra treatment required?
The Broome County Health Department is charged with enforcing the drinking water standards for all water supplies in Broome County, and there have been other supplies around the county, town of Kirkwood, town of Conklin, some of the wells in the town of Vestal that for at least a short time exceeded the drinking water standards. And in working with those municipalities, we did require that they install treatment, because it didn't look like those levels, in the short term at any rate, were going to go be below within the drinking water standards. The Randy well in the village of Endicott was somewhat of a similar situation where when we began to monitor there, we did see vinyl chloride exceeding the state standards, and in that case we were able to find a responsible party who did help the village install a treatment system on that particular source. The South Street well field has had levels for the last 20 years that have been more or less constant and have never exceeded the drinking water standards, and because of that we've not required that the village install a system. Some of the other supplies that I described around the county had treatment put on their wells even when the levels didn't exceed the standards, because there was a concern from their community members consuming the water just about the safety of the water. And I think what this does is provide another measure of reassurance, even though the levels are within standards, that everything that can be done, possibly done, is being done to minimize exposure to the extent possible. So I think there is a general concern in the community that the village board and the mayor has reacted to, and that's the reason for installing the treatment system.
Let me say one thing. Isn't it safe to say, Bob, though, that this is almost like a preventative type of thing?
At this juncture, in this investigation, I would say we're starting to identify all the different exposures that exist in the community. We're trying to identify ways to not only correct those exposures, but to prevent those, like capturing the soil vapor before it gets in the home. So I think that's a good analogy, Greg, in that if we can remove the chemicals before they ever get to your tap, that certainly is a prudent approach, even though the chemicals, the levels do meet the drinking water standard.
Question here. Birth defects may manifest in a short period of time. However, cancer cases may take longer to be recognized or detected. How will you track cancer cases in ex-residents? Also, how will that information be integrated into the study? How are these added cases factored into expected cases?
Sure. The way that we calculate or determine our cancer cases are where the person lived when the cancer was diagnosed. So if somebody was diagnosed with cancer in Endicott and then moved, we would be able to capture that cancer case because we would have their residence or their address at the time of their diagnosis. However, you are correct when you state that we will miss some people. Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your position in doing a study, people move around, and there's no way that we have, no formal way to track people who have moved out of the state or moved out of the Endicott area, and then developed cancer. We don't know everybody who's ever lived in Endicott. And developing that type of information is incredibly difficult. So the best that we can do at this point is figure out for a time period, the time period we're looking at for cancer is 1980 to the most recent data available, and looking at that data and saying, okay, of the cancers which were diagnosed in people at that time, and calculating our denominators based on the population at that time that we get from the census data, how many, that we capture these people, and that we capture the people who were there and diagnosed at the time. We realize that we will miss people who move out of the area, and that is one fundamental limitation of doing this type of study. But there's not a very easy way to try to capture those people. People want to move around for whatever purpose, whether it's seeking new employment or living with family members or moving out of the area for other reasons. And it's just very difficult to track those people. So this is the best way that we know how to capture at least a snapshot of the population and determine that.
Matt Braun, 10 Delaware Avenue, Endicott. Has my cancer come up yet in your form? Because I'm waiting for them to test my building again. But I'm the 5th cancer patient, and I literally have to beg them to retest it again. So my name hasn't come up yet, I guess.
We haven't looked at any of the cancer data yet, and even the cancer data that comes in, it's confidential, and we don't re-release the information out. It's really important for us to protect confidentiality. When the data comes in, we don't give it back out. But I guess the more fundamental thing is that we have not had access to the cancer data yet to look at it.
I see.
We're talking about the planned health study that we are intending to do.
And about the cleaning up the situation here, the plume. If they put 2 more of these air aerators in, it would take 80% of the stuff out within 10 years. Why don't they put a dozen in there and clean it up in 2 years?
The material that is in the groundwater is really the source of the vapors that are in the soil and in your home. And because of the chemical composition of that material, it wants to stay in the groundwater and cling to the soil particles in a chemical type of bond. And the rate that you can remove that has an upper limit to it. And there's no technology that we're aware of today that can increase that rate beyond a certain point. And once you get those chemicals out of the groundwater between the soil particles, you are still left with the chemicals that have physically penetrated the soil particles, and that is an even tighter, that is a very tight chemical bond. And it comes out very, very slowly. And as I said, we don't have a technology that's been identified yet that can strip that material out.
Well,
so while they may be able to reduce the concentrations over a 7 to 10 year period by 50%, to get that next 50% may take a little longer. And to get the next 50% may take a little longer yet, because once you clean the area that is free between the soil particles, now you're trying to pull it physically out of the soil particles. And it's just going to be a long time. So, and I know up until 2 years ago, I think the health department would agree, we didn't see that the concentrations in the groundwater were going to be a problem. It wasn't until, and we had this conversation before the meeting, it wasn't until 2 years ago when another fellow from our agency was working on another project with a federal committee that they were looking at a problem that occurred out in Colorado. And he was looking at that site saying, wow, IBM looks just like this, and wow, they have a problem with indoor air contamination. I wonder if we have the same thing. And by coincidence, they were going through a 5-year review on the operations, that everything that IBM had done, and it all blossomed into what we have today. I think that's kind of a summary of where we are. But to sum it up, the material that's in the groundwater off-site is definitely going to go at a quicker rate than what's on site. And the best that we can do at the moment is try to cut that movement of material from on site to off site and stop that transition and get the groundwater cleaned up underneath all your homes as quick as we possibly can. And we really don't have a good handle on how long that's going to take.
And you know, with my property, I talked to you about that. It's hard for me to believe that all the neighbors have these ugly smokestacks that they put in, and I'm the only one that they haven't done. They were going to retest it in the wintertime. Nobody has shown up yet. I wish the winter was over. I'd rather have that, but nobody has shown up yet.
Okay. We didn't have time before the meeting because they were pushing everybody to their seats, but if you can come and see me after the meeting, and I'll get your name and address, and we'll talk to IBM about that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
The other part of that answer, though, too, from our perspective, is that we've got a pretty good handle on what needs a system right now, but all the edges and the fringes and everything else and the loose ends need to be tied up. what our role in this is that, you know, we got to make sure that when a day's done and the sampling's done, that we're satisfied that there's nobody else that needs a system on. And there's 2 points. One is they're not done until we say they're done, and I don't have any concerns anymore. The other part of it is the mitigation systems. We consider those a temporary measure. Now, temporary might be a long time, but I don't accept anything less than what, you know, what Bob's saying, looking at how fast and what you're suggesting. You know, is there something better we can do? If those systems got to be on somebody's home for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, well, can we cut that in half or whatever? That's my perspective in this thing. They're temporary. We're going to ask them to do everything we can to minimize that time. We're going to have them look at whatever there is to look at. And if there's nothing that can improve the, you know, if they can't do any better right now, well then we ought to be able to explain to you they can't do anything better right now and why that is. But beyond that, there's always new technology that comes up, and we'll be looking at that as it becomes available. And if there's something that looks promising, we'll tell them to evaluate that next year, 5 years, whenever that is. So don't think that, you know, once this sampling this winter comes, we're just happy to get out of here and we're gone and we're not looking at this. This is a forever deal until there's nothing to worry about anymore. And as long as those systems are on homes, I got things to worry about.
Yeah, I would just like to add one thing, that when Gary was saying we would go back and reevaluate, it's the department's plan, not only with this project, but with every project that we work on, that so long as that project is running, at every 5-year mark, we go back and reevaluate what's been done. Is it working? Is it working to the best of its ability? Are there things that have been developed over the last 5 years that can be employed here to change what we're doing and speed the cleanup? And that will continue with this project as it does with every other project. So when we finish here, we're not finished with an evaluation. We'll be back in 5 years and do it all over again.
Going on this topic, okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on, again, going back to the reason we're here tonight, the Public Health Response Plan, and listening to your questions as they're coming up. This is what we hope to achieve in this Public Health Response Plan. To gather these newer questions, to hear them, to be able to respond back to you on these questions you have. But not just you. There may be others who have similar questions. And again, reflecting on the group that we hope to have together, that hopefully these people can communicate with you and get back to you with the answer. You don't have to hear it from us, you can hear it from them. But I just wanted to take a moment and reflect and also congratulate you people out here. You are the people who are committed and have concerns and want to talk to us, and we want to help people like you. So think about that when you're filling in. Do you want to be part of this group?
Okay, and talking on time-wise mitigation of this problem and lowering the levels, and having been at some of the meetings where the one public map from 1980 was made available that showed that they had a pool behind Building 18 near the tracks that was 70,000 gallons, and the fact that IBM is admitted to pumping 66,000 gallons of pure trichloroethylene. Do you guys have any idea how much actually might be under Endicott?
Under Endicott or under the...
Well, under the area that we're discussing without you guys knowing the parameters of the whole field yet. I mean, this is kind of frightening to think how many years that have been leaching from 18 down under our homes heading to the river. How many other pools or low spots has this collected in that have never been tested? You guys have never drilled down that far to find out what might actually be down there. Do you have any estimate, any idea? I mean, this could take centuries to clean up.
Why don't you tell them how many wells we got in? And
I believe we have over 200. Well over 200 monitoring wells, and there's a number of recovery wells that are on-site and off-site. The amount of holes that have been put in the ground in Endicott is probably more than you will find any place in the country. We know more about this site.
Do you just have an estimate, a ballpark figure?
But to answer your question, no, we do not have an estimate of what's coming out. What we do know is that there is no more pure product being pumped. Everything that's coming out now is in a dissolved phase and has to be stripped out of the water to be captured. And I think they're pulling something on the order of, is it 4,500 gallons a year now, or 4,500 pounds? I forget what the number is. But they are still pulling material out. The overwhelming majority of it is coming from the plant site. A very small proportion of it is coming from off-site. Unfortunately, that very small proportion of what's in the groundwater is causing a problem in the indoor air.
Well, what I'm saying
I can't answer your question as to how much more we might pump out. I really can't tell you.
Okay, because what I'm saying is if they had a 70,000 gallon pool right behind there, the guy estimated, and that was their consultant giving them the best rosy picture he possibly could, how many years had it been leaking out, and is there other collection basins around Endicott where there could be 70,000 gallon pools sitting around you don't even know about? This is a possibility, because I saw the aquifer thing, how the sediment pools would actually form on this stuff.
What they've proposed, Wayne, and what's important is to cut off whatever might be coming from the plant site from getting into the neighborhood. I mean, not to say that we won't try to clean that up and reduce those concentrations as much and as quickly as we can, but from a public health perspective, you know, again, it's all about exposure. So if we can stop stuff from migrating from the source, which is what they propose to do, then we deal with what's left out there in the community, which is what you're speaking to. We've got a good handle on where it is, you know, how wide, how deep, what the concentrations are. The only thing we haven't done is calculate the mass of it, as you're suggesting, which, you know, over that plume, you know, really as far as remediation and the mitigation systems doesn't play into it all that much.
Okay. Now, I guess my next question would be, they're proposing a new air stripper, I guess, behind my home at the end of Columbus Avenue. I'd seen in the paper there was talk of another building with an air stripper in it and stuff. Is this going to draw this stuff down to them homes right there? Because we already got the one by the Monroe Market running for 20 years. Now you're going to have another one on the other side of them homes. Is it actually going to draw it, yes, from the outside, but pull it under those homes before it gets to the air stripper?
Anything that would be proposed, we would look at, is like, you got two concerns. One, you're going to knock down concentrations, and you want to knock down the mass of the stuff. But certainly we would never approve anything that would cause a problem or exacerbate a problem for somebody. So, you know, with what they're trying to do, there's lots of, you know, just lots of different ways to approach these things. They put in a proposal for what they feel would work. We're right now reviewing that proposal, and we'll come back with comments of, well, either this is okay and great, do it, or yeah, this looks good as a start, but here's what else we want you to do.
Okay, I guess
that's the process that we're in right now.
Yeah, up until now, they've seemed to do whatever they felt was right, and that was the end of it, and no one else overseen them. Okay, I'll let some other people get in.
They're no longer doing whatever they want, and you know, we can discuss that, but we're watching them.
I'd like to take a moment to get some more of the cards, the questions. We have a question here. What specifics can you tell us about regarding testing west of Jefferson Ave? Will all residents in Endicott have access to testing?
The testing of west of Jefferson Avenue will be done on a starting in the areas where we know that we have a contamination, and the testing will move out in a logical sequence from that location. Obviously, there are going to be places where we will be able to identify that no more testing is necessary. So yes, there are going to be places that won't be tested. I can't tell you where those are right now. We haven't started that work yet. But any place that we feel does need testing, we're certainly going to be asking to do that. You as a homeowner don't have to allow us to do that, but the request will be made. And I don't expect that information to be available for quite some time yet. It's probably going to be near the end of the year. before we get to some of that work. And by the way, if we do find areas that we do want to get into homes and do that testing, if we do find that there is a problem in working with the health department, we are prepared to put systems on at state expense.
I have another question here. What are the qualifications and/or background for a person interested in being a part of the stakeholder planning group?
I think Bernadette pretty much outlined exactly the qualities. I don't want to say qualifications. I'd say qualities are more important. If you are really concerned, if you are willing to commit your time and effort, if you're dedicated, if you are able to communicate well to the best of your ability with people who have or share similar concerns, very important. That's not to rule out people who you think and would like to submit, who you believe may have some qualifications, okay? For instance, a medical doctor. If you would like to submit somebody who's a medical doctor who's willing to commit that time, that would be fine. An engineer, a toxicologist, that would also be extremely helpful. A member of your, who is a member of your community. And there are other elements aside from the professional issues that possibly would qualify someone. And I think the idea of qualification is more on your side to make more than ours. We will do our best to work with everyone that we meet with, everyone that we confer with and communicate with. But this is your chance to either, and your opportunity to submit either yourself or somebody else who you believe would represent you well. And as I said, that being yourself. We do need to have people, as Bernadette mentioned, who are open-minded, who can listen to other opinions, can advise others what they've learned. So again, does that answer a question that you guys may have about who qualifies or who's better or not? Or is it too vague yet?
It shouldn't preclude an ordinary citizen with
Absolutely
no particular background. I mean, don't feel that you need to be a doctor or an engineer or whatever to serve on this committee. I think, you know, a willingness and an open mind and all these things everybody's been talking about, I mean, that's the bottom line. These other things might help you when you're on there, but part of our job, as Bernadette brought out, is going to be education. The other members of the committee can be relied on for that kind of stuff. So, you know, we don't have any preconceived ideas about who should be on this. So, you know, don't be bashful, folks. Gabe.
Marty,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I just missed it, but this morning at the earlier session, you had said if people submit somebody else's name, they should check with that person to make sure.
I did say that earlier. Yeah. That's okay, but thank you.
Yeah, let me add just one more thing to that. I mentioned earlier the person's name, Linda Gillick from Toms River. I know for a fact that she didn't have a PhD in environmental health coming into this, but she was the best person to lead that group. And after it was all said and done, we probably could have given her an honorary PhD in environmental health because she learned a lot of things and was open-minded as one of the qualities, I think, that Bernadette talked about earlier.
Hi, my name is Artie Block. I'm a regional representative for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. I'm based out of New York City.
Based out of New York City. And once again, this agency is a federal agency. You're a part of?
The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is an independent federal environmental health agency. Our main headquarters is indeed based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and we are part of and work very closely with the Centers of Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia.
Would you mind telling me what's the purpose of this hearing tonight?
Certainly. Mainly it is our initial attempt to evolve from our original meetings with CARE and RAGE here in the community to expand it into the greater community. We're introducing our public health response plan, and this is a draft plan that is intended to the best of our ability and hopefully working in unison and in cooperation with community members to try to respond to their health concerns associated with the various releases in the area.
Is your agency going to be the lead agency?
That's an excellent question. There is no lead agency in this effort. It is a combined effort between local, state, and federal agencies. Broome County, State Health Department, State Environmental Conservation, and the ATSCR.
Does that present some kind of logistical difficulties with so many different agencies all trying to figure out, coordinate logistically?
In this case, it does not, and mainly because we are used to working together. ATSCR has and continues to have a cooperative agreement with New York State Department of Health. We've had this agreement for, goodness, almost about 12 years now. We have been certainly working together in cooperation over those years, and we know how to do it.
And what's your feeling? How many people were here this morning?
This morning's meeting, about 40 to 45 people.
And what's your feeling about the community response to your efforts here?
I think it was well received, mainly because I think most of the people who were at that first meeting felt that, in fact, there was going to be a possibility that they were going to be listened to, that they were going to be responded to. Nonetheless, I'm sure there's still a lot of skepticism. Like many efforts, this one will require time, trust, cooperation. In the long run, this public health response plan may last anywhere from 2 to 4 years.
Now, what's your opinion of the level of this situation here compared to, say, Fishkill, the levels that are there?
It is often said in environmental agencies that every site is different. And every site poses some very different challenges at times. There are similarities, there's no question about that. There, for instance, as the one you mentioned, Bill, it is a groundwater issue, similar to this. They do and will have issues, I'm sure, about vapor intrusion. So there are similarities there. But to compare one with the other in terms of which one's worse or whatever, when it comes to the individual person within that community, it's bad for each one of those people, and that's the best I can define it.
But I mean, if you just look at the levels, just from the numbers situation, would you say Fishkill is worse or Endicott's worse, or they're about the same?
I would not put any gauge on that, Bill. I'm sorry. That's something I think every individual reacts to differently, and so no, I wouldn't say one is worse than the other in any format or any sense.
Okay, thanks, Arthur.
Sure, Bill.